Greetings. This is Paul the Poke from PaulthePoke.com. Today's topic, Nehemiah. We're going to look at his resume. We're setting this up. Nehemiah is going to be the one that approaches Artaxerxes. And we're looking at, within the greater context, we're looking at the timeline of God's clock being started. God's prophetic clock being started to the return of Christ the first time. And so who is the man that initiates this on behalf of God? What's Nehemiah when he approaches Artaxerxes? And so today we're going to take a good look. Just who is Nehemiah? What is his resume? And a little bit about the guy. Nehemiah 1, verse 1, the words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. Now it happened in the month of Chislev in the 20th year as I was in Susa, the citadel. And I think Chislev, that's about this time of the year, November, December, on our Gregorian calendar, relates to the time of Chislev on a Hebrew calendar. I think it's the 9th month off the top of my head. I'm sure if I'm wrong, there'll be some of you folks out there to correct me. Please do. Nehemiah means Yah comforts. So his name is a reminder, Yah, God, Yahweh, comforts. Of note, I read this in a lot of the literature I was looking around as I was putting this together. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah were originally one book, and they were later divided into two books by Jerome, the Latin translator. And I pulled that comment from Holman Illustrated Pocket Bible Handbook. Now, granted, I saw that in several other places. So if you do want more background information in historical context to this time, you may want to read both books as we have it in our Bible, Ezra and Nehemiah. And they both, they do go back to a time, Ezra and Nehemiah, two of the three men that were responsible for Israel, nation Israel, going out of captivity back to the promised land. So Nehemiah is one of three men who would lead the Israelites back to Jerusalem. And this process took close to 100 years for it to be completed, to complete the return from exile to Jerusalem. So the first of those three was Zerubbabel, and he led a group of about 50,000 back to rebuild the temple. He was the first one to go. Ezra followed about 80 years later, and he restarted temple worship service. And then roughly 13 years later, Nehemiah made the request of King Artaxerxes to return and rebuild the city of Jerusalem. And that's what we're going to be focusing on, and we have been focusing on during the course of this study, is the issue of the rebuilding of the city of Jerusalem. Before I get into that, I think it's important to note God sent a group of people back first to rebuild the temple. His worship, his house, was more important than the city of Jerusalem. So God's order was rebuild the temple, reinitiate temple worship service, then we'll worry about the city of Jerusalem. So who's Nehemiah? Well, Nehemiah 11, verse 1, part B, now I was a cupbearer to the king. And this little artifact right here on the left, this cup, is a cup that they think was pulled from Artaxerxes' time. They think he actually drank from this. I think it was in the New York, some museum in New York, maybe the Metropolitan, I'm not sure. But the claim was, in this picture, open source, by the way, community property. It's okay to copy it. So they said that Artaxerxes actually drank from this. So Nehemiah was a cupbearer, or a mashka in the Hebrew, and it's also translated, the word can be translated as butler. And this is the position of one who serves the king wine. He would be a highly trusted individual, and he would be paid well. And historically, a cupbearer was also a high-ranking official in the kingdom, and it was a position of influence. And I think Joseph ended up in Egypt in and around a cupbearer. And that's how he gained some of his influence with Pharaoh. So Nehemiah, the same with Artaxerxes. And he would also, a cupbearer would also be a taste tester for the king. And historically, some of these folks were poisoned instead of the king. So there'd be times when a king would have the cupbearer drink and swallow wine before him, make sure it was safe. So if somebody goes down, it would be the cupbearer. He would be the one who would die instead of the king. And so if you're interested in some of those customs, I got that from BibleHub.com, topical cupbearer. Several different encyclopedias within that website. And so there were like 4 or 5 different encyclopedia comments on the role of a cupbearer. So Nehemiah, he served also as a governor of Judah for King Artaxerxes for 12 years. And we pull that from Nehemiah 5, verse 14. Moreover, from the time that I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah, from the 20th year to the 32nd year of Artaxerxes the king, 12 years, neither I nor my brothers ate the food allowance of the governor. So he was one of those folks who, yes, he was a governor. Yes, he was a position of influence, but he didn't eat the prime food that the governor would allow to be eaten. Neither did he have any of his brothers. So they ate like the common folks. They didn't place themselves above the people and eat the good food while the people ate the crumbs. He ate the fare of the people. So he didn't take the privilege that was allotted to him, let alone abuse it. Kind of a man of the people in that sense. And then later, Nehemiah was appointed governor of Judah a second time. Now, the length of this term is not stated, and we get this from Nehemiah 13, verses 6 through 7a. While this was taking place, I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I went to the king, and after some time, I asked leave of the king and came to Jerusalem. So it doesn't say how long he went back to Artaxerxes and when he came back to Jerusalem. But it's pretty clear when you read the remainder of Nehemiah 13. Nehemiah, he's in a position of authority and made multiple declarations and decrees. And he returned vessels to the temple. He reinstituted the tithe on the people on behalf of the Levites. Elements of the sacrificial system were restarted. Treasurers were appointed for storehouses, and the Sabbath was enforced. So, and then socially, we're going to talk a little bit more about this one. Nehemiah called on Jews to not intermarry and swear an oath of allegiance to God. And arguably, within the context of that, he was for one common language of the people. And the thing, not so much to intermarry, but the focus is to swear an oath of allegiance to God. So it ultimately would boil down to idolatry with the people. And the example he uses is when Solomon and all of his wives, he married pagan women. And the result of that is all these pagan altars popped up all over Israel. And then it led people to idolatry. And Nehemiah's point is like, look, even Solomon, he was caused to sin because of the worship of false gods and idols. And we see this right here. Made them take an oath in the name of God, saying, you shall not give your daughters to their sons or take their daughters for your sons or for yourselves. Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin on account of such women? Among the many nations, there was no king like him, and he was beloved by God, his God, and God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, foreign women made even him to sin, and the sin was idolatry. And, let's just get along. He built a whole bunch of temples up on high rocks and high places and in the mountains. And the people began to worship the gods of these women. And, in closing, shall we then listen to you and do all this great evil and act treacherously against who ultimately? Our God, by marrying foreign women. And so that's kind of a principle to any of you young men out there. If you think you're going to marry somebody and be unequally yoked, if you think you're going to overcome that, you're not. There's a long list of men who ultimately commit idolatry by following the belief system of the woman they marry. And that's why, today the issue would be, God calls us to not be unequally yoked. Believers should marry believers. You have a common belief system in God as the foundation. But I also want to take a look up here, starting in, verse 23. In those days, the Jews married women of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab, so it'd be modern day Jordan. And half their children spoke the language of Ashdod, and they could not speak the language of Judah, but only the language of each people. So Nehemiah sounds like he was a believer in a common language. Probably back in the day, that would have been Hebrew. And then now, can you imagine if this were to happen today, in the uproar in the uproar that would be created? And this is God's chosen man, who he had go back to Jerusalem to rebuild the city, Nehemiah. And this is what Nehemiah says he did. He, in verse 25, and I confronted them and cursed them and beat some of them and pulled out their hair. And then also made them swear an oath of allegiance to the name of God. Worship God is the idea. So, and I know the critics out there, that's just barbaric. How could you worship a God when a man confronts people, curses them, beats them, pulls out their hair? And that's God's chosen man to rebuild Jerusalem. It doesn't say he was a great, kind leader of people, but he got things done. And he did what he thought was appropriate. I suppose that's a discussion for another day, whether or not God approved of all of this. But, from Nehemiah's standpoint, nothing a good ass whipping and pulling out some hair won't solve. And then when he closed, you can look at the tail end of it, and it's kind of a summary of what he did. As closing up as his time as a governor of Judah. Nehemiah 13, verses 30 through 31. Thus I cleansed them from everything foreign, and I established the duties of the priests and Levites, each in his work, and I provided for the wood offering at the appointed times and for the first fruits. So he reinstituted the religious system, sacrificial system, the feast days, that's the appointed times. And he put Israel back on track with following the law and made sure provision was made for the priests who were teaching the people or intercessing for the people on behalf of God with the Levites. So he did his best to put everything back together as Moses had written it down in the law, and get back to the worship of the one true God. And then he asked at the very end, remember me, oh my God, for good. So you can say his heart was in the right place. And that's what he wanted, was for people to turn back to the one true God of Israel. So that's the man who's going to go petition Artaxerxes and end up starting God's prophetic clock. And we're going to find out. Imagine this. I mean, it is down to the day, literally down to the day that Jesus walks through Jerusalem from when this decree was issued by Artaxerxes. And we're going to get into that more the next time. So appreciate you guys following. If you like these posts, please feel free to share with others. PaulthePoke.com. You can also click on the blue box. Sometimes there's a gray box. Type in your email address and receive notification every time we post something. And this is going to be categorized. This is within the context of Gabriel's message to Daniel in Daniel 9. And that's currently where we are. And I think we're on about verse 25. We got 2 more verses to go, but there's a lot of content in those 2 verses. And then after we complete that, we're going to probably take a look at some things that Michael said and who the angel Michael was. So I appreciate you guys following along. Hope you have a great day. Take it easy. Bye.